So welcome to this afternoon of Dictators. The idea of this conference, well, of course, there are many origins of the conference. I remember myself in the 1990s thinking for a brief couple of years how the world was getting better. The Iron Curtain had come down. Most of the dictators had been kicked out of South America. But as we know, the dictators have done pretty well in the last 20, 25 years. So it's back very much on the agenda. And as Tim has just pointed out to me, something which I didn't know, if I did, I'd forgotten, that this year is in fact the 2100th anniversary of Sulla's dictatorship. So as every conference has to have an anniversary to celebrate, that's ours. So the format of the afternoon will be, we're having, as you can see from the programme, the papers in two pairs. As I say, I'll chair the first one and Tim the second, and we'll run the first two papers consecutively, and then depending how the time is going, we'll have a moment for questions and discussion afterwards. So my first duty then is to introduce Tim Cornell, who is the president of the Roman Society, in case anybody hadn't noticed. For many years, professor of ancient history at Manchester, I think well known to everybody, I hope, in this room. Written many interesting articles, books on particularly the history of early Rome, and responsible just a few years ago for that colossal volume of the fragments of the Roman historians, which I was just looking at the other day, 2,736 pages. You checked every single line, I trust, Tim, didn't you?
I did.
Anyway, Tim is this afternoon going to speak to us about Roman dictators and modern politics. Tim.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, well, I think I ought to start by defining dictatorship. What is a dictator? Well, I think the answer is that we know one when we see one. Here's a selection of notorious 20th century examples. I'm sure you can identify them. Perhaps the pointless answer is the one on the top right, who is Antonio Salazar, the Portuguese dictator. But anyway, this crew, each one of those could be defined as a non-royal autocrat who exercises absolute power by decree and in perpetuity, and is answerable to no authority other than his own. Now, the word dictator, of course, is Latin, and its use to describe political despots is based on the historical example of the men who proclaimed themselves dictators in the last decades of the Roman Republic, Sulla and Julius Caesar. And the name of this extraordinary magistracy was adopted as a term, general term, for any comparable type of autocrat, really from the Renaissance onwards. To give just one famous example, Milton, in talking about the infernal crew, the hordes of hell, describes Satan's command in these terms: unanimous they all commit the care and management of this main enterprise to him, their great dictator, whose attempt at first against mankind so well had thrived in Adam's overthrow, and so on. I'll have to go on reading that for the rest of the afternoon, but still. This is an early use of the phrase, the famous phrase, the great dictator, of course, which was later made famous in the Charlie Chaplin satire of 1940. But there was another and much more positive and benign tradition of Roman dictatorship. This was the famous emergency magistracy of the earlier Republic. It's well known that in times of extreme crisis, the Romans would suspend their constitution and appoint a dictator, a single man who would hold supreme power until he had ended the emergency, or for 6 months, whichever was the shorter. The classic case is that of Cincinnatus, This is a fragment of the Fasti Capitolini, the Fasti Consulares, and it names dictators as well. And 5 lines down, you can see Lucius Quinctius, Lucifilius, Cincinnatus, and his Magister Equitum, his assistant, Lucius Tarquitius Flaccus. That is in the year we call 458 BC, according to the chronology adopted by this inscription. Now, Cincinnatus was called from the plough, as you will remember, when news arrived at Rome that the consul's army had been surrounded by the Aequi and was facing destruction. So Cincinnatus left his plough, went to Rome and organized an army, marched out and defeated the enemy in a great victory. And after returning to Rome in triumph, he laid down his power and returned to his ploughing. He'd been in office for just 15 days. Now, this feat was repeated many times in the Republic by many dictators who finished their task within the allotted time. This was a matter of pride for them and their descendants, and actually very few, as far as we know, were timed out. That is, they failed to do anything and their time ran out. So that became a mark of shame. Now, the historical record of this institution has a long and rather interesting legacy. Political thinkers have always marvelled at the efficacy of this method of dealing with crises. From Machiavelli, Jean Baudin, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Alexander Hamilton, and many, many others have commented on what a fantastic institution this is because it worked so effectively. The example of Cincinnatus in particular is a 19th century painting of him being summoned from the plough, has always stood for selfless dedication to the public good without expectation of reward, and in general for modesty and lack of political ambition. The most famous comparison with Cincinnatus, of course, is George Washington, who in 1775 was called from retirement at Mount Vernon to lead the Continental Army, which he did without salary until 1783, when he resigned his commission and returned to his estate. At that point, his successor, Henry Knox, together with the other officers who'd served under him, founded the Society of the Cincinnati and made Washington their first president. The medal shows Cincinnatus at the plough, and there's a statue of him with his plough outside at a park outside Cincinnati. And in 1790, one of the founder members of the Cincinnati, Arthur Sinclair of Losantiville, Ohio, renamed his hometown Cincinnati. That's how it got that strange name. The other early dictator who achieved lasting fame and most people have heard of was Fabius Maximus Cunctator. There's a statue of him. Looks as if he's taking his head off, which is very strange. Fabius Cunctator, the one man who, by delaying, restored the state, in Ennius's famous line. He gave his name, as you will know, to the Fabian Society, the socialist organisation founded in 1884, of people who urged gradual reform rather than revolution. And therefore, a Fabian strategy is one which takes it slowly and in steps rather than trying to get everything done all at once. Fair enough, but it is ironic, of course, that a left-wing group should name themselves after a dictator, and above all, a man who otherwise showed himself to be a reactionary curmudgeon opposed to all initiatives of every kind. Some early socialists actually raised this point. H.G. Wells was one of them, said, look, is Fabius really an appropriate model? But it didn't actually matter, because the only thing that really counts and the only thing they ever make anything of is the name Fabian, and that's fair enough. But the positive assessment of this traditional restorative dictatorship, as I think we call it, the idea of restoring the state to where it was before after the crisis, the positive assessment by thinkers such as Jean Baudin was the inspiration for Carl Schmitt, the most famous theorist of the subject, whose work, Die Dictator, was published in 1921. Now, Schmitt famously distinguished between two types of dictatorship: commissary dictatorship, kommissarischer Diktator, and sovereign dictatorship, souveräner Diktator. The former, a temporary commission conferred in a state of exception, Ausnahmezustand, a state of exception conferring on an individual the power to deal with a specific crisis in order to restore the status quo ante. While the latter, the sovereign dictatorship, was a new and permanent rearrangement of state institutions to produce an autocratic and effective form of government in perpetuity. Now, Schmitt was an enthusiast for both types, especially the second, which became flesh in the person of his friend Adolf Hitler. Schmitt became the leading jurist of the Third Reich, and throughout his long life, see, up to 90-odd, he remained unrepentant and produced new editions of his work through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The work remains extremely influential. It's always been quoted. It's never been out of print. And finally, in 2014, Cambridge University Press published an English translation. Now, Schmitt's distinction between two types was based on the historical record of early Roman dictators like Cincinnatus and Fabius on the one hand, and autocrats like Sulla and Caesar on the other. But as Wilfried Nippel has pointed out, this was not his own original thought, as he claimed, but was lifted wholesale and without acknowledgement from dear old Mommsen. Mommsen, in the Staatsrecht, the second volume, the first edition of which was published in 1877, a couple of years before this splendid portrait. I love the bits of screwed up paper, you know, even the great Mommsens. Mommsen, in the Staatsrecht, dealt with traditional dictatorships as one of the regular magistracies. So we have the consulate, dictatorship, what do we call it, magister equitum, consular tribunate, praetorship, provincial governorships. While the rule of Sulla and Caesar was regarded as something totally different and lumped together with the decemvirate and the triumvirate as exceptionally constituted powers, außerordentlichen Konstituierenden Gewalten. Now, this distinction, in spite of attempts to undermine it by scholars who include Claude Nicollet, I think these attempts are actually totally unconvincing. The distinction, to my mind, is wholly valid, that what Sulla and Caesar had organised for themselves was just in every possible way different from the old dictatorship. The traditional dictatorship, which was strictly time limited, as we've seen, and task specific, you know, you are a dictator for 6 months or for however long it takes to deal with this particular problem, has become a model for what is nowadays called constitutional dictatorship, the title of a famous book by Clinton Rossiter, originally published in 1948, or even simply as what is nowadays called the Roman model, as an effective way of dealing with emergencies. And it continues to haunt the pages of political science even in the 21st century. Since 9/11, the passing of the Patriot Act and the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, political scientists have been agonizing about states of emergency and the question of whether a liberal democracy can justify the suspension of civil liberties in times of crisis or under terrorist attack. And the Roman model has played a part in these discussions. This is just one example of an article 2006 by Nomi Lazar, who's a very interesting writer on various branches of political science, but particularly on states of emergency, a major book in 2009. But this title shows how she's bringing the Roman example into her discussions. Now, what everyone has agreed upon, from Cicero to Machiavelli, from Jean Bodin to the Cincinnati, from Carl Schmitt to the political scientists writing today, is that the traditional dictatorship was an effective way of dealing with critical emergencies, which the Republic was always able to overcome, and without any dictator ever trying to perpetuate his power, which I suggest is pretty surprising and suspiciously successful institution in that sense. Even so, I think most Roman historians would accept the general picture, and until very recently, it has never been seriously challenged. But I'm confident that it is mostly wrong, and that it completely misrepresents the actual function and purpose of the historical dictatorship. Now, in the early Republic, there were nearly 90 dictatorships recorded in our sources, principally Livy, and other literary sources, and the Fasti Capitolini examples here with the consul list, but every so often, 4 lines down, you get the last bit of the name Camillus, and it's his 4th dictatorship, Camillus IV Dict, and then Aemilius Mamercinus, his Magister Equitum, and Rei Gerundae Causa. They were appointed for getting the thing done, or however you want to pronounce that. And then another dictator 2 years later, Manlius Capitolinus Dictator, and then Seditionis Sedandi et Rei Gerundae Causa. So for some dampening down sedition and for getting the thing done. And his Magister Equitum was actually, what's his name, Licinius Calvus, primus e plebe, the first Magister Equitum to be taken from the plebs. This was in 368 BC, according to the chronology of the inscription. Now, nearly 90 dictatorships are recorded in the 300 years from 501, the beginning of the Republic, to 202, the first dictatorship tradition in 501. So in that 300-year period, there were 90 dictators. In 202, the last dictator held office, and then it lapsed until Sulla revived it in a completely new form. The earliest dictatorships in the first 100 years or so in the 5th century are relatively infrequent and of very doubtful historicity. The episode of Cincinnatus in particular is almost certainly a legendary morality tale. We could make the same claim, I think, about Camillus, who was supposedly dictator 5 times. Here's his 5th dictatorship, 367. That makes him a record holder. But he's a very shadowy figure, and his role in, for instance, in the Gallic catastrophe and so on is widely suspected as having been fabricated out of nothing. Maybe his claim to fame, the authentic claim, is that he was dictator at the time of the capture of Veii. So the early dictators, there's a shadow of doubt hanging over them, and the later ones after 300 BC, the dictatorship really fades out of existence during the 3rd century. There are very few instances, and it had to be revived, actually, in the Second Punic War when Fabius Maximus was appointed to deal with the emergency after the Battle of Trasimene, 217. So, actually, the heyday of the dictatorship was the period of 60 years from 366 to 302. If you want to know how 366 to 302 can be 60 years, see me afterwards. In this period, there were some 40 dictatorships in 60 years. That is one every 18 months on average. This fact is not very well known and rarely acknowledged, even by Roman historians. And I'm just wondering how many people here would be able to name any of the 40-odd dictators who held office this time. Of course, the period that we're dealing with, the 4th century, is not widely studied, and the main literary source, Livy, books 6 to 10, was hardly ever read by anyone before Stephen Oakley. Even so, It's saying something if no one in this audience, and let's face it, this is the Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies, cannot name a single dictator. After all, these are supposed to be men who were called upon to save the state in dire emergencies, to save it from extinction. These are men who saved Rome, and yet no one has heard of them. Actually, you're all forgiven because they were indeed relatively obscure figures. Maybe in their own time they'd held the consulship and so on, but they're not household names now. And the other point that I would make is that they are obscure because they did little worthy of note. What is wrong is the idea that they were appointed in emergencies to deal with critical threats. This idea is false for two reasons. First, because the historical record, and principally I mean Livy, does not bear it out. And secondly, because there's something absurd in the idea that in this era of increasing prosperity and continuous imperial expansion, this is the age of the Roman conquest of Italy after all, that every 18 months on average there occurred an emergency so dire that the regular constitution had to be suspended and a dictator appointed to save the republic from extinction. It doesn't make sense, and of course it's not true. The long series of dictatorships at this time is not to be taken as a sign that the Romans were continually facing critical emergencies or as evidence of their success in dealing with them. So what were these dictators for, and what did they do? Well, the answer is simple. At this period, Rome had only a limited number of senior magistracies, to wit, 2 consuls and 1 praetor each year. There were junior magistracies, aediles, quaestors, etc., but only 3 senior ones with imperium. So if a situation were to arise where no magistrate was available for some necessary task, the only remedy open was to appoint a dictator. The appointment could be to provide an additional magistrate if something cropped up and the regular magistrates were already engaged on other tasks, or it could be to provide a replacement if one of the regular magistrates was incapacitated by illness or even death. Such cases could be occasionally represented as critical. In 362, the consul Lucius Genutius was defeated and killed by the Hernici. So Appius Claudius Crassus was named dictator and rectified the situation with a hard-won victory, Livy tells us. But these instances were very rare. In the century from 366 to 264, there were 75 triumphs, but only 5 were celebrated by dictators. Again, in that period, there were 45 dictators, but only 4 of them celebrated a triumph. 4 because one of them celebrated 2 triumphs. That's Papirius Cursor. And even then, his second triumph as dictator in 310 BC is not mentioned in Diodorus's parallel account, and its authenticity is doubted by Stephen Oakley, and therefore I would say it's extremely doubtful. That is a clear demonstration, it seems to me, of the absence of any correlation between dictatorships and serious military crises. While I'm on the point, I would refer to Papirius Cursor's first triumph in 325, when, as dictator, he won a great victory over the Samnites. Now, Papirius Cursor was one of the heroes of the Samnite Wars. Livy thought he was terrific, and he's the man who Livy named in his famous essay on what would have happened if Alexander the Great had turned westwards and attacked Italy instead of beating up people in the Near East. And Livy thinks that he'd have met more than a match in Papirius Cursor. But if you look at Livy's account, Papirius found himself in command at the battle, the so-called Battle of Imbrinium, but we don't even know where that was, not because the situation was critical and he'd been appointed dictator to deal with it, but because the consul conducting the campaign, Lucius Furius Camillus, fell ill and was unable to carry on. If he had remained in good health, then Papirius Cursor wouldn't have got a look in. So it's an accident, actually, that he happened to be dictator at the time of that battle. The record as we have it shows that the great majority of dictators were appointed to carry out routine functions or to replace or to work alongside the existing magistrates. Now, sometimes this involved conducting a military campaign, but only rarely was that a major military campaign, and as we've seen, it hardly ever resulted in a triumph. Otherwise, dictators were dealing with tasks such as holding elections. In the Fasti Capitolini, it says, comitiorum habendorum causa, or to hold games or festivals, ludorum faciendorum causa, feriarum habendorum causa, etc. Or to fix a nail in the wall of the temple of Jupiter, dictator clavi figendi causa, a ritual that had to be carried out every September by the state's highest magistrate, the praetor maximus. That's to say, normally the consul holding the fasces, but if he was unavailable, away on campaign or something, then a dictator had to be appointed. Now, this is all quite well known, but my point is that most of the dictators, rei gerundae causa, the ones who were conducted to conduct some actually serious operation, military or civil, were also routine functionaries carrying out tasks that the consuls were unable or unwilling to carry out themselves. And in the event of a major war, the consuls were careful to ensure that they got the chance to take command and that it didn't fall to a dictator. So they're just replacements and supplements to the existing system. In any case, dictators rei gerundae causa became less frequent in the later 4th century, and by 300 had been phased out altogether. And the explanation for that is that a better method had been found to achieve the same result, namely the appointment of pro-magistrates. Now, by this date, by 300, the Senate had achieved a tight grip on the conduct of the state's policy. The Senate was now able to define each magistrate's task much more precisely. This is the origin of the concept of provincia, and to assign provinces to the elected magistrates of each year. And if more commanders were needed, they were able to prorogue the commands of the previous year's consuls, who became proconsuls, or they could even confer imperium, usually pro praetore, on former magistrates who were now private citizens, bring them back and appoint them for some specific task. This began in the years after 300 BC, for the first time really seriously in 295, which was the year of the Battle of Sentinum, that great battle of the Samnite Wars, a genuine emergency, which, if the traditional view had any substance, ought surely to have called for a dictator. But what the Romans actually did was that the battle, the command was taken by the consuls, Fabius Rullianus and Decius Mus, and other people, including Appius Claudius the Blind, were appointed pro-magistrates. They were brought out of retirement and given minor commands. So the dictatorship no longer had any function because pro-magistrates had been invented that could do the same thing much more effectively. The problem with the dictator was that the consuls had to appoint the dictator and they could appoint anyone they wanted. This way, the Senate could keep absolute control. In the later 3rd century, the dictatorship survived on and off in desiccated form, when the dictators had a purely ceremonial function. In other words, almost all of them were appointed to hold elections, games, festivals, or to fix nails in the wall of the temple. A residual memory survived of the archaic function of the dictator as an expedient in times of crisis, so the tale of Cincinnatus still lived, and was revived after the Battle of Trasimene when Fabius Maximus was given supreme command against Hannibal, which no doubt gave rise to the probably false notion that the existing magistrates had to submit to the dictator's authority. And later, when Sulla revived the dictatorship in a completely new form, giving rise to the equally false idea that the dictator had the right to execute citizens without appeal and was not subject to the tribunician veto or any other restraint. But that's another story, which I shall leave to Catherine and Federico. Thank you very much.